This movie starts with Meredith sailing on a small canoe to an island where the South Solitary Lighthouse is situated. The canoe has her uncle, George, in it. Meredith can be seen favoring a particular sheep, holding it close to herself, while other sheep are littered about the canoe. A ship can be seen at the back of the canoe, suggesting Meredith's journey began in the ship. George complains about the route they're going through as he pukes. Meredith doesn't say any word or show any concerns. She soliloquizes and tells herself she must remain cheerful. On the island, kids can be seen running and playing. Meredith sees this and smiles at it as the waves keep brushing the water against the rocks. Jack is seen using a mechanical engine to wheel luggage up the hill. It's stuck, and he calls for help. Harry, the assistant lighthouse keeper, comes and helps him fix the problem. Jack continues wheeling the luggage up. Meredith, carrying a sheep, climbs the hill and meets Harry, who welcomes her and helps her finish her climbing. Harry points her to her accommodation and tells her she could go make a cup of tea. Jack finds it a battle when trying to wheel the luggage up the hill and almost crashes with it. Meredith admonishes him to be careful as the luggage belongs to her mother. George and the other passenger on the canoe can be seen making their way up the hill. While on the hill, she meets a little girl, Nettie, at the side of the walk path and stops to greet her. Meredith wants Nettie to look after the sheep for her till she gets settled in. Nettie agrees with pleasure and takes hold of the sheep. As she continues her walk to her cottage, two teenagers can be seen pursuing a flock of sheep past her in a playful manner. They get hold of one of the sheep and carry it to their mom, Alma. Alma locks it inside, with Meredith at the scene. Meredith introduces herself to Alma as the niece to George, the new lighthouse keeper. Alma complains how the previous keeper who took their life left the island in a bad state, and they have to do a lot to get the island back in a good state. She commends her husband, Harry, and states that Harry has been a very important factor in the island, but also complains how Harry isn't held in high esteem. While the two women continue talking, her sons can be seen chasing down two sheep. Alma joins them in the chase. She finds her room and takes her luggage there. The room has two windows and a small bed in the middle. Harry takes George on a tour of the island. George complains, saying they let the animals on the island wander freely and wonders why they haven't built the places meant for the sheep. Harry mentions they try their best to keep the place in order. Harry's son tries to chip in a word about the sheep, but ends up making George more infuriated with their style of keeping the animals. While on the tour, he wonders why Jack isn't on the tour with them. Harry explains Jack was busy tending to some other issues. George cuts in and tells him what his presence means in South Solitary. He commands that Jack be fetched at once. George continues his tour and checks the tower. After doing his check, he tells Harry and Jack he has a letter from the superintendent of lighthouses and states that the letter contains allegations against this particular lighthouse. He hands over the letter to Meredith and asks her to read it. Meredith reads out all the times there were issues on the station and states their dates respectively. About one of the allegations, George remarks that he's never heard of such an anomaly in all his years in the field. Harry takes responsibility for the last allegation and explains what went down that day. George seems appalled and asks if Harry had been drinking. Harry admits they drink once in a while and mentions the fact that they feel stuck there and it gives them no option. George says he'll report to the superintendent and warns that this might call for his dismissal, and then he storms off, with Meredith following behind. Meredith walks back and finds Nettie sitting with the sheep earlier given to her. Nettie mentions her interest in looking after the sheep and perhaps having the sheep sleep over at her place. Meredith reminds her that the sheep is hers, but suggests they could look after the sheep together. Nettie suggests they name the sheep Lucile, which Meredith agrees to. All the while this conversation goes on, Nettie can be seen feeding her sheep with milk from a baby feeding bottle. Later that night, Meredith is seen putting an apartment in place when she hears the chirping sound of beds from the stove. She quickly takes the kettle off the stove and pours the water into the stove to quench the fire. She rushes out carrying a tray of teacups and a lantern in her hand. She climbs a tiny stair all the way up to meet George at the tower. He shares his thoughts that Meredith might have forgotten about him. She apologizes and mentions that she had a hard time with the stove. She tells him the tea isn't hot as he likes, and also tells him the bread she's brought isn't much as she hasn't unpacked. George mentions the tea is not fit to drink, and she apologizes once again and promises to sort it out the next day. He asks Meredith to sit for a while and proposes she stays till his shift is over. While they're asleep, an alarm bell rings and wakes them up to horrible disgust. Harry comes and explains to George and tells George Jack gets a hard time and he behaves quite funny. He further tells him that any time that happens to him, the alarm bells go off George seeks for his whereabouts. He's told he's in the tower, and he decides to go see him. George remembers Jack is an ex-soldier who had injuries from bombings and wonders what he's doing, serving in a lighthouse. The next morning, George comes back and Meredith welcomes him. He mentions Jack wasn't in a good state, and he had to help him finish off his shift. With a deep sense of humor, he requests for a pot of porridge and a hot pot of tea. Meredith goes outside and meets Nettie. She has a little chat with Nettie, who shows Meredith her acquired scarps. Nettie takes Meredith to the pigeon house, and they release the birds to fly. Nettie had mentioned earlier they use the pigeons as a system of communication. Much later, Jack knocks on the door and Meredith goes on to answer it. He wants to meet with George and Meredith welcomes him in. He meets George and seeks to explain about the incident that happened the previous night. He mentions he's sorry and promises that incident won't happen again. George isn't convinced, and he's now aware the incident is a frequent occurrence with him. George thinks he has a condition that makes him unfit to serve in a lighthouse. When George asks Jack about his history, he mentions he was discharged from the military because he was wounded. George thinks there's more to it. George tells him to go back to his duties, but warns that a repeat of that incident would see him suspended from his duties and taken out of the island. Jack assures there won't be a repeat. All the while, Meredith stands in a corner listening to the conversation. Meredith is typing on a typewriter when Nettie walks in and startles her. She mentions her love for being a secretary, but ended up only as a typist. Nettie sees a framed picture of a man and Meredith explains that it was her fiancé who died in the war. Nettie seems to have a little bit of dark humor as she laughs and mentions the man has a funny face. They hear the sound of chirping birds, and this vexes Meredith. In a short while, Harry is seen on the chimney, taking out the birds. Harry, Meredith, and Nettie walk some length to go drop the birds to rest while they have a chat. Harry reckons he has 6 months before leaving the island. When Meredith asks his plans after leaving, he mentions he has quite a lot to do, but really wants to send the kids to school, and Nettie is opposed to the idea of going to school. He mentions it's not a place to raise a family. He thinks the place can alter people's behavioral patterns, as it has done with Jack. They reach their destination and drop the birds. Back at George's office, he's reading past reports concerning the station. He notices Meredith is struggling with the knitting she's carrying out and offers to help. While helping her sort it, he states he isn't surprised as to why ships have abandoned this station's route. Meredith believes the incidents may just be a few and can happen anywhere. George is angry with Meredith as she doesn't see things from a matured point of view and asks her to go to bed. She goes, while George continues knitting. Nettie is seen wheeling Lucile around with her newly built carrier, specially designed for Lucile. Meredith tries to tend to a cow when he sees Jack drying out his clothes. They steal a stare and go their way. Meredith is having a chat with Alma. She is eating a piece of cake and isn't too sure how the cake tastes. Alma wants to know why Meredith isn't married and goes where her uncle goes. She replies she hasn't seen the right person for her. Alma tells her she'd never meet the right person staying on the island. She mentions she doesn't expect to meet anyone at the moment. Alma tells her time isn't on her side, especially if she wishes to have a family. Meredith, now a little bit sad, mentions her inability to give birth, citing that she doesn't have a womb. Alma is surprised and presses forward when Meredith mentions she was having an operation some time back and a complication occurred which prompted the doctors to remove her womb. Alma guesses it was an abortion she was having, and she concurs. She feels she was young and foolish then, but Alma opines at 29 years of age when she did the operation isn't a young age. Alma wonders why she didn't marry the guy who impregnated her, but Meredith states he was married at the time. Alma still holds the opinion that staying on the island isn't the best decision, as she might end up like a certain Elizabeth Turner who never married. Alma further states Elizabeth's only interest in life was waving at ships, no matter the weather. Meredith thinks Elizabeth might have given up on love based on previous disappointments, but Alma doesn't think so and states she just loves waving at ships. Meredith doesn't think she has the same disposition as Elizabeth. George is seen conducting a drill for Harry with Jack standing by. Harry makes a mess of the drill and prompts George, who's now a bit furious, to make him start again. Later that evening, Harry knocks on Meredith's door. She quickly covers up as she was in the bathtub and meets him at the door. He says he was just passing when he decided to make a stop and check on her. Meredith welcomes him in. Meredith thinks Alma should join them, but Harry states she's busy. He mentions his likeness for taking walks at that time of the evening after dinner. Meredith shows concern about the visit, but offers him a cup of tea. He has other plans as he brings out a little bottle and states adding a drop of its content in tea would help her sleep well. She states how nice and decent her uncle is, regardless of how they might have perceived him, and goes on to prepare tea for George. He sees George's paperwork that is probably meant for the superintendent and blurts out that Meredith puts in some nice comments about him. This puts Meredith off, and he quickly claims he was only joking. He goes on to say Meredith has made the place lively and lovely with her smile and demeanor. He states further that Nettie thinks highly of her. He mentions that Alma isn't very affectionate, but he's gotten used to it. He thinks Meredith looks good in her nightie. While he says all these, he keeps staring at Meredith's backside. Meredith says she doesn't always wear something as fine as this, but wore it as she was having her bath when he knocked. He wishes Meredith didn't mention her having a bath, as he, hearing that, has mental pictures of her having the bath. This upsets Meredith a little bit. Harry apologizes, but states his feelings for Meredith. He implies it's quite hard for him, as the island is small, and they're confined to seeing themselves all the time. Meredith reminds him he's married, but he replies that all marriages are not perfect. He asks Meredith to come sit, while he flirts with his words. Meredith wishes he hasn't seduced her in any way. Harry says no and wonders if Meredith has any form of feelings for him, while he caresses her hands. Meredith agrees, but tells him she sees him only as a nice person. Immediately, Harry kisses Meredith, who doesn't resist at the spur. Meredith is now seen rushing up the stairs to meet George, who has been waiting for her. She explains that she had some issues with the stove. She drops the tray and sits there. Meredith walks up to Nettie, who is playing with the pigeons. She inquires about Lucile from Nettie, who nonchalantly answers that she doesn't know where Lucile is. She tells Meredith that Lucile escaped earlier. Meredith faults Nettie for neglecting Lucile and wonders why she couldn't bring it back if she's incapable of taking care of it. Nettie replies that her mom told her Lucile will be fine. Meredith is angry and storms off to look for Lucile. She walks for a while and meets Jack, who is standing in front of a tombstone. She asks him if he has seen Lucile. Jack replies but doesn't seem interested. Meredith, out of anger, says some harsh words and tells him he should learn to be civil. She notices he's standing by a tombstone and quickly realizes he might be having a sober time and makes an apology to him. She passes by Harry and Alma as they sit at the porch of their apartment. She tells them she's looking for Lucile, but Harry reckons it'll be a difficult task. They advise her to be careful, and she walks off. Harry walks up to meet George in the tower and finds Meredith there with him. George asks if Harry is done with his task. He says he is, and George remarks they can start the next task the next day. As George walks down the stairs, Meredith walks behind him when Harry holds her close to himself and kisses her. Meredith now seems to be enjoying these flirtatious moves. The next day, Meredith meets Nettie and her brothers in their secret hideout, playing poker. She mentions to Nettie she hasn't found Lucile. She apologizes to Nettie about the way she spoke to her earlier, but Nettie and her brothers keep laughing at her. After a while, they ask her if she's had her bath. She doesn't quite understand the laughter and the ensuing question. She goes tending to a cow when Alma meets her and tells her the cow is theirs and not the station's cow as she believes. Later that night, Harry is having sex with Meredith when Nettie walks in on them. They are shocked and Nettie mentions Alma sent her to call Harry. She tells them Alma isn't happy and has gone to tell George. She calls Meredith a slut and runs off. Harry and his family are seen with their bags leaving South Solitary. Meredith is writing a note that implies she's well in South Solitary, but cries while writing it. She goes out and releases 2 pigeons. They fly a very short distance and fly back. She realizes Nettie had lied to her all the while. Jack and George are finding it hard sending the wheeling machine up. Meredith comes to help when George lashes out on her. He angrily tells her she's the one who put them in this position, as they now lack an extra hand in the station. He mentions he's disappointed at the kind of person Meredith is. She leaves, crying. Now in the house, she continues crying and sobbing, while Jack and George struggle to wheel some luggage up. She looks for ways to pacify her uncle, but to no avail. The uncle doesn't want any of her supposed meekness. Even in his obvious discomfort, he chases Meredith away to go tell Jack to take a shift, while he nurses his pains. George isn't getting better, so Meredith writes a note seeking the help of a doctor and hopes the pigeon can send the message. She is now seen typing a letter in George's stead, presumably to the superintendent, telling him of her shameful affair with Harry. She goes back to call George to resume his shift, but doesn't meet George in a good condition. She decides to help with the shift and goes to take over from Jack, who tells her to keep an eye on the burner. She has no knowledge of what happens in the tower, but has to stay for her uncle's sake. She notices something is wrong with the burner and tries to sort it out, but ends up making it go in flames. Seeing the burner in flames, she puts it off with water, and this puts out the electricity in the tower. Jack comes back to save the situation as Meredith explains what happened. In the morning, Jack tells Meredith she could have stated George's health challenges to him. He asks to know how George is faring when Meredith mentions he's passed away. Jack assures he'll look for a way to call the attention of a ship, and then he goes about doing that while Meredith watches. She tries to send the pigeons, but they don't fly farther than the island. They make a coffin for him and put him inside. Jack reckons they might not be lucky in quickly getting a ship come their way, as Meredith already implied George shouldn't be buried on the island. He tells her he tried preserving the former headkeeper's body, but it didn't work out as he planned. He also states that he had tried to preserve the body in the bathtub Meredith currently uses, and this irritates her. She thinks they could have told her about it. They place the coffin on a chart and Jack rides off. Jack is seen digging a grave. Meredith reads a funeral book, but the book isn't expressing exactly how she feels. She begins a speech from her heart and mentions how George has been the only family she has. She also mentions that George was extremely good to her and begins crying. They go back to lighting up the burner in the tower. They get to know themselves when Meredith asks about Jack's days in the military. Jack doesn't want to be bothered with his past and storms out of the tower. She finds Jack much later and apologizes. She mentions she only asked because she had a fiancé who perished in action. She mentions she only received a letter that Jack's life was cut short in action. Jack asks where her late fiancé served, and she states it. Jack replies the late headkeeper probably served around there, but there's nothing that can be done as he's passed on now. The next morning, Jack brings some firewood for Meredith, and she thanks him. He voices concern, saying they should brace themselves for rough weather in the coming days. He offers that Meredith uses his bathtub. It's windy and Meredith finds her way to the tower. Jack teaches her a few things about the tower and how the tower works. It starts to rain and hailstones are falling from the sky, almost shattering the glass roof. They reckon they'd have to stay in the tower as they can't go out due to the bad weather. While she sits at a corner and knits, she notices Jack doing some embroidering on a fabric. She requests to see it and admires it. Jack mentions that being in the station gives him enough time, hence why he does it. He says he likes staying on the island, but Meredith complains she can't cope well in such a place. She's aware of the loneliness the place comes with. Jack reckons he isn't good with people and doesn't need people either. They're stuck in the tower as Jack suggests it isn't safe to go out, but she really needs to use the bathroom. Jack escorts her outside in the wind as she takes off her clothes to ease herself, while Jack turns his back so as not to watch her. They are back in the tower, and Jack teaches her how to use the flags as signals. Much later, Meredith is concerned about Jack's sleeplessness and suggests he get some rest. He shuts her up and says he'll sleep when he wants to. This comes as a shock to Meredith, who thinks Jack can't trust her on her own, hence his decision to always be awake and monitor her. That evening, she talks to Jack about the things he must have heard about her. She mentions that she's a nice person, and her only flaw might be that she gets desperate for attention. Jack says he doesn't know anything about Harry's eviction from the island, and it's not his business. Meredith feels otherwise and states she's his business now as long as they are stuck on the island together. She wants Jack to acknowledge her existence on the island. She apologizes to Jack immediately, admitting she was ranting. The alarm bell rings again deep into the night as Meredith goes in search of Jack, who's having a crazy night like the one he had when George just arrived. She can't do anything as Jack walks away talking. In the morning, she searches for him and finds no traces of him. Later that day, Jack walks into the tower to Meredith's excitement. She apologizes about the incident, but Jack quickly tells her she can go as he's now on ground to handle the shift. Jack notices she uses the flag in wrapping herself and asks her to take it off. This doesn't go well with her, but she takes it off grudgingly and walks off. She walks close to the shore and finds Lucile. She's happy to see her lost sheep and staggers to catch it. Jack sees her struggling with the sheep and comes down to help her. Jack states he isn't fit to have company, but Meredith thinks otherwise. Meredith thinks he's the best company she's had. He argues he isn't good with people and cites the incident that occurred the other night, but Meredith tries to make light of the situation. He mentions the incident occurs with him when he's anxious about it not occurring. Meredith wonders why, and he states he didn't want her to see him in that crazy mode. Meredith calms him and tells him it's not always as bad as he makes it seem. He offers her his jacket and helps in guiding her and Lucile up the island. While on their way, they notice a ship coming their way. Jack uses the flag to make a signal to the ship, and tells Meredith to go pack her bags. She makes him stop sending the signal and says she'd rather stay with Jack on the island. She confesses that she has had a good time with Jack and wishes to stay with him on the island. Then she thinks of the possibility of Jack not wanting her and tells him to forget about everything she has said. The next morning, with her bags already packed, she sets out to leave the island and requests to have Lucile as she leaves. Jack helps her put Lucile on the chart, and she gives Jack a pair of socks knitted by her as a gift. He acknowledges he needed a pair of socks, and they ride off to the shore. Jack hopes Meredith would write to him when she can, and Meredith hopes Jack would reply to her letters. They find it hard to say their goodbyes. Jack quickly hugs Meredith, who holds him tight, but they release themselves immediately. Jack thinks they could have done that better and kisses Meredith on the lips immediately. Her journey back to the ship seems refreshing as she enjoys it, wearing a bright smile as the canoe sails on.